To me, the best motorcycle in the world is a Harley-Davidson, and it always has been, and it always will be. It's just like, it's just ingrained. It's just cool and rich in history and style, and you can't deny that. Harley-Davidson is just, I can't even explain it. It's just ingrained into my soul. My name's Dean Micetich, and I'm one of the co-founders of Dice magazine. I grew up in South London. I had kind of an unusual upbringing. My father was in a rock and roll band and was obsessed with Americana and the 1950s. So my youth was spent growing up listening to Chuck Berry and driving around in old 50s American cars and wearing Levi's. It's always been in my blood to obsess and be passionate about all things American, and that included cars and motorcycles. And from a very young age, a lot of my dad's friends who he knew through having old vehicles had bikes and cars and things like that. So when I was about 11 years old, one of his friends had a 1951 Royal Enfield for sale. I think it was about 200 quid. And he bought it. I don't know why he bought it, because he's not really into bikes. He's more into cars. But I think, he just liked the look of it and had it. And of course, as soon as he got it, I was like, oh man, I need to ride that thing. And, from riding a bicycle to riding a motorcycle, in England, it's a big jump because we don't really grow up riding dirt bikes like a lot of the American kids. We kind of ride bicycles until we're about 21 and leave home when we're about 38. Yeah, he took me out to this parking lot with the motorcycle. I was 11, so it was 1991. And this thing it was a 125 motorcycle. So it was a tiny little bike. It was actually called the Flying Flea by Royal Enfield. But it was hand clutch tank shift. I thought I had pretty good balance back then. And I was proved wrong on the first go. But I did get the hang of it. So after I crashed it once, laid it down, I just putted around on this thing in the parking lot, and that was it. I was like, this is great, because it was kind of, it sounds crazy, but it was just my mum and dad in the background, and I was like, I'm getting away from them. This is a real escape. Any chance I would get, my dad would go to car shows, like vintage car shows, and hook a little trailer up, bring the bike, and I would just putt around in the field, or if it was a private little setting that wasn't on the road. And that was my first kind of experience of motorcycles, and it was a vintage one, so I just dived straight in. I met Matt in must have been about 1994, 1995. I was 14 or 15. And like I said, there was this whole kind of like underground rock and roll car Americana lifestyle culture in London. And so there'd be these different clubs, throughout London on the weekends and stuff like that. And people would ride their bikes and drive their cars and have a great time. It was there that I met Matt one night it was North London, Camden Town. There was a pub called the Russell Arms, and our friend Mouse was the DJ, and he was playing really good rock and roll, and people were dancing. And, it was just a really cool, fun and exciting time in London. And he was just part of that scene. I remember just, seeing him around and being on his bike and his car. And, I always thought he was super cool, but from a distance, and we just, at some point, just kind of got introduced to each other. And it was like, hey, he said something like, hey, I really like your shirt. I was wearing some crazy, like, pink and black diamond shirt, some rockabilly 50s thing. And I was like, yeah, man, I really like your car. And he's like, oh, cool. And it kind of all sparked from there. And then, of course, my dad had a Chop 50 Merc, and he had a 34 Ford. And, I was trying to build this 32 Roadster at the time to get running for when I was ready to drive, and, all this stuff. So, but with Matt was actually, I was born in 1980 and Matt was born in 1960. So there was a 20-year difference. I was 15, he was 35. It was kind of like, there was a big age gap, but it didn't really matter because there was all these different people that were all hanging around at the same time. And it just, that's how we met. So Matt was somebody I really, really looked up to on so many different levels. He was just really positive and really like excited about things. And he, even to the end, he would always just see the good in everything, where I can kind of get a little bit mental and be like, oh, what does that mean? Or why did that guy say that? Or, like, he's like, who cares, man? Just, just have fun. Don't worry about it. Like, he really opened my eyes to be a bit more open-minded too. So at this time, I was listening to 50s music and driving 50s cars and wearing 50s clothes. And at the time, I didn't think it was weird. And he was like, hey, man, have you heard Oasis's new record? I'm like, what? That wasn't made in the 50s. You can't listen to that. Like that kind of thinking. It was really mental. And he was like, no, man, you're going to love it. And so, I looked up to him because he was just so open-minded, and he really honestly didn't care what other people thought. He just did what he was passionate about. One of the good things about starting Dice, it came from his outlook on life, as far as he told me a story that changed his life. And it was, around 1976, he was 16 years old. He was kind of listening to the Rolling Stones and had like a nice blow-dried haircut and flares and stuff like that. And his friend said to him, you got to come and see this band play tonight. There's this new rock and roll band. You're going to love them. They're called The Damned. He went to this college, to this gig where there was 10 people in the audience, and he saw The Damned play live. And he said from that second, it just blew his mind. He was like, wait a minute, they're just kids up there doing this, because of course it was like always the older generation that told the younger generation what to do. And this was the turning point where he was like, this is, you live how you want to live. It doesn't matter how old you are. You don't get told what to do by somebody else. You just go for it. So he went home, got a pair of scissors, cut his own hair, all messy. And from that day on, he said, this was before the term punk rock had been coined. He said, because in 1977, when the term came out and it was national press, punk is over at that point because it's too mainstream. This is like doing your own thing and not being labeled. But he said this was like the turning point for him. So he always took that as, rock and roll and punk rock isn't just about music. It's about your state of mind. It's about doing things because you want to do them. Like, don't listen to anyone else. Just, as long as you're a nice person and you're not harming anyone, just go for it. And that was so refreshing because I'd come from like the 50s car world, where it's like so regimented, like, no, your cuffs have to be this high and you have to listen to that. Oh no, that was made in 1960. You can't listen to that. It's just so many rules of a culture that's supposed to be ruleless. I'm like, as soon as Matt told me that, I was like, I get it. Fast forward to 2001. At that point, me and Matt had started a band together called Magnum 500, and it was like a 60s garage, kind of loud. I mean, we were terrible, but we did look good on stage. We sounded awful, but we looked good. So we were into the whole thing, cars and bikes and music. And I was going to art school at the time, and it was just a great time to be in London. And there was like, good music, Oasis and Britpop, and whatever you think about that, it had its moment, and it was just, it was a really good fun mix. And in 2001, I graduated from St. Martin's College and went to California. And, because my dream had always been I always knew I was going to live in Los Angeles. I just knew it, because my whole life, everything was just Americana. Like, I don't like the Beatles and I don't like Morris Minors. I like Elvis and I like Harley-Davidsons and Levi's and Coca-Cola. Like, that is my passion, and it has been even when I was in England. So it was just natural for me to move to LA. So in 2001, I went to LA. Well, actually, I was in Orange County, living with a friend of mine, Steve Carpenter, and just living the California lifestyle. And back then, there was a lot of cars. Like, as far as hot rods and stuff like that, there was a big scene for it. But as far as vintage motorcycles, there was hardly anybody under the age of 30 that had a cool old motorcycle. There were the Sinners, a handful of guys that had, really cool Harley-Davidson choppers and bobbers and stuff like that. For me to know somebody that was under 30 and owned, say, a Panhead was like, no, there was 2 or 3 people like that. So I went back to England after a few months and was talking to Matt about everything that was going on over there. And, obviously he was still he probably, because he would buy and sell cars and bikes all the time. He'd be like, right, I'm going to keep this car. This is like my dream car. And then 3 weeks later, he's like, no, I'm going to sell that car. I'm going to buy this one because this one's my dream car. So, he was just really excited to know what it was like out there and get out there and see what was happening. And on one of the trips back, it was around 2002, he was like, hey, man, I think we need to start a magazine. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, well, there are no magazines out there that are catering for what we like. Let's just start a magazine with things we love. Nobody's going to buy it, but it'll be fun to do it. And I said, well, yeah, okay, fair enough. I've never really done anything with money in mind to be the first kind of goal. You know what I mean? It was like, yeah, let's just do it. We never thought it would ever be successful. So I went to his house. Actually, no, he was at that point, he was living on a boat on the River Thames. Because Matt, he was always like, just very inspirational, where it's like, I have this beautiful house in South London, but the mortgage is a lot and I kind of want to live on a boat. If I sell this house, I could just have a boat. It's like, he would just, and he didn't really think about it too much. So many people overthink everything and never get to do anything. He thinks of it and goes, it'd be great to live on a boat. And 2 weeks later, he's living on a boat. And he was like, hey man, check this out. I've got the front cover. I was like, of what? And he was like, that magazine we were talking about. I'm like, oh yeah, the magazine. Okay. I said, how did you do it? I said, did you get the InDesign or something? He said, no, man. He said, check this out. I went to PC World, which is like, like Radio Shack or something. He said, I went to PC World, man, and InDesign was like £1,000. But I bought this. It's exactly the same. And it was 20 quid. And I'm like, it cannot be the same. If that's 20 quid and that's £1,000, this is definitely not the same. He's like, well, the instructions are in Russian and I can't understand it, but I think we can work it out. It was this like PC program for like old women to put cards together and print out like little floral designs and stuff. And the funny thing is, like, we use that program for, years and years and years. But anyway, so I rush onto the boat. He's like, check out the cover, man. I was like, dice, huh? That's cool. And he was like, yeah. I said, well, what does it mean? He was like, nothing. It means nothing. He was like, we want something that's like one word and it's classic and it's clean. And, it doesn't have to say choppers and bobbers or hogs and heart. It's just like, just a classic, simple, clean. And I was like, and that's it? He's like, yeah, just thought it might be, just sounded good. Like there was nothing really behind it except for it was just a classic word. And he made the E big as well. And I was like, oh, I like that. That looks a bit arty to me. I like that. And he's like, yeah, right. Looks good. I'm like, yeah, cool. So my first Harley-Davidson was a 1966 Sportster Ironhead XLCH that me and my friend Scott Craig and Jeff Worms turned into a nice 60s Southern California looking chopper. And of course, I'm super excited. It's my first Harley and, I can barely start it. I'm scared of it, all that good stuff. I remember we had this ride going on. There was a group of us going. It was me and Matt and my friend Will. And my friend Will pulled me aside and he said, hey, man, we got this kid, man. He's a great photographer. He said, we really want to get some of his stuff in the mag. He's been hanging around for a couple of months and I'd like to introduce you. He's going to come on the ride with us. And I think Matt lent him this 1970 shovel head, full dresser, huge bike. He said, this is it. His name's Josh Kerpius. I want you to meet him. And I was like, oh, hey, okay. So, and of course, Josh comes up to me and he's like 18 years old. I'm like, hey, man, nice to meet you. Will tells me you're a great photographer and I'd love to see your stuff. And he said, yeah, I'd love to get some things in print. I'm like, yeah, it sounds great. But the funny thing is, so the ride leaves from LA and it goes over Angela's Crest, windy mountains, zero visibility on what's coming around the next corner. And it's beautiful, but it's terrifying at the same time. And I'm on my bike and I'm, obviously in my mind, I'm like, do I look good? I've got my vest on, okay, cool. No front brakes, but I'll figure it out. So anyway, this 1970 Harley shovelhead comes blaring past me. And there's this 18-year-old kid I've just been introduced to turning around with his camera, going into a curve. And I'm like, oh my God, this guy's insane. I just think, what is he doing? Because I'd never ridden with Josh before. And even back then, he was like such a great rider and he's just got so much soul and he feels it that it was just almost like it was like ballet. Man, he went into this curve on the biggest bike with no ground clearance, taking pictures. And it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. I mean, I was terrified, but I was like, that guy is a natural and he's insane. And of course, we've been best friends ever since, but I was just like, man, that is punk rock. So after the Ironhead, I kind of got a little bit frustrated with always being the last person in the pack. Everybody's on a big twin. They're on the freeway doing, 75, 80 and kind of just like cruising, no problems. And I'm in the back, like at the limit, just thinking this thing's going to implode any second, just scared out of my mind. So I was thinking, I've got to get a big twin. So like 2008, 2009, I was like, all right, I've got to get a big twin. So I found this 57 Harley Panhead on eBay that was in Rome, Georgia. And it was restored in the 90s. It had marble flames on it. It had skulls everywhere. It had like tassels. It was a nightmare. So it got shipped over, and I remember just looking at it. And I remember Matt looking at it, and I was almost in tears thinking, what have I done? Why did I buy this? And of course, Matt, in his usual way, was like, oh man, this thing's going to be so fantastic. Great. Pass me a wrench. Let's get on this thing. I'm like, really? I'm thinking about sending it back. And he's like, no, man, come on. So we took it apart, and it was just on the floor. It was just the frame, the motor, the transmission, and the back wheel. And I was like, that's all I'm going to use. And he was like, oh yeah, we'll put this front end on it. And I was like, why did I buy a complete bike? He was like, no, it's great. We can sell all the bits you don't use. And I'm like, good thinking. There's always like, the positive, no, this is great. Even if it was the worst bike he's ever seen, he's still like excited about it. A good friend of mine, T-Bone Jones from Noise Cycles, he, fabricating motorcycle parts and working on bikes. And he's my favorite motorcycle builder. He's, in my eyes, the most talented and has great style. So I remember I called him and I was like, hey, T-Bone, what's happening? And he's like, oh, not much. I'm still doing some bike. I said, hey, I need some handlebars. And he said, all right, okay, cool. I said, can I drop the bike off? And he said, oh, and I just need a couple of other bits and pieces, but mainly some handlebars. He's like, yeah, well, I'm pretty busy. I said, come on. He was like, all right, drop it off at my house. He calls me the next day and he's like, what is this? He said, this needs way more than handlebars. And I was like, well, yeah, it needs, tank mount, sissy bar, fender mount, foot pegs, headlight bracket. And he was like, yeah, thanks. I was like, come on, man. And he was like, all right, I'll get it done. And he just, in lightning time, just handled it. And I just remember going to his house and being like, oh man, you're the best. What do I owe you? And he's like, oh man, that was a lot of sleepless nights. He's like, $500? I'm like, I love you. So then we took it to my other friend, Keo, who was at the garage company at the time, and he wired it and basically got the clutch adjusted and all that. And I've been riding that bike ever since. I mean, it's had a couple of small tweaks, but I mean, I love that bike. It's so reliable. 10 years later, still riding it. I mean, I don't get to ride it as much as I used to, but I mean, it's one of those things that it sounds ridiculous, but even if I look at it now, I just get goosebumps. I'm like, oh, it's the best bike ever.